when they got ready to make the award, it was a $50 award. They decided that we're not going to make that award to this Negro. So they, for no reason, decided to give that award to somebody else. But I won it, and I understood the injustice of it. The police and the judges were they were thinking like they had arrived at truth, and so one could not get justice because the police had the authority to exercise power whenever he desired without any reference to the rules of the Constitution, the provisions of common decency. So that we saw a lot of police brutality and saw a lot of suffering, needless suffering. I guess the area where there was the greatest suffering was in the cities, the small towns, where people who were just a few years out of slavery had to deal with how to cope with life when there was so much opposition, injustice, and ungodliness prevailing in the neighborhood. I think my parents were very wise, and they were not alone. They were parents of 14 children. I'm the 9th of 14 children. But they taught us that this world is not our home. That we are pilgrims here, and we are representatives of the kingdom of God, and that we should act like it in spite of what the white and colored signs say, in spite of what injustice occurs, and that they were very strongly influenced by the biblical story of the children of Israel being delivered from Egyptian bondage. And they felt that there were two major things, modalities that would save us from the hopelessness and the suffering and the injustice that we faced. And they taught us with consistency, by not only by what their words were, but by their behavior, that it is critical to know Jesus. They said you've got to know the Lord and follow Him and learn of Him. So we read the Bible daily. We got into the wonder of worship, and with reckless abandonment, worship of God.
What did worship look like? Particularly, Amir, you used the word hopeless a few times. Mm-hmm. So what was worship like when that...
Worship was a time of escape.
Yeah.
And I say that because that's what it was. Sure. Yes, how are you going to endure the pain, the hunger, abuse, neglect, denigration, and suffering if there's no safety valve? So worship was a safety valve, and it was there that we, the mothers and fathers were somebody. They could be a deacon or church mother or deaconess with a white hat on. They could take on some added personalities and identities. So worship was an escape, but not just an escape, but it was also an exercise in spirituality that had reality in it. It was real. We heard the story of the chariot swinging low, and the David and the giant, in his triumph, and the power of God to overcome whatever. So the parents taught us, and they were not alone. They taught us that to endure this suffering and this hopelessness, you need to have firm faith that the judge of all the earth will do right, that God is fair. And you must hold on to that in spite of what happens, in spite of seeing the suffering and the inequities and the unfairness. You still have to be consistent in believing that God is fair, and that weeping may endure for the night, but joy comes in the morning. Then they said that another thing that you have to really do is to pursue education. Even if you've got a one-room schoolhouse, you apply yourself and you pursue excellence in your pursuit of education. And they did that so well by modeling what the best they could do. My dad had a third grade education, and my mother didn't finish college or high school. But they said, we want our children to be, and there were lots of us. You're going to be a lawyer, you're going to be a doctor, you're going to be a dentist, you're going to be a professor. And they labeled us and said, that's what you're going to do, you're going to be that. And if you tell a child that over and over, they begin to be that, become that. As a result of that, we have, among my siblings, there were 2 lawyers, a dentist, a college professor, organized educator, registered nurse, teachers, social workers, so that we all got a little college. And because the parents said, don't make no difference about how much money you have, you go in and do it. And the hit song that they sung to us, that the Lord will make a way somehow.
So, Bishop, if I can, maybe you can touch on this while you're here, because there's an inextricable link in the black community with faith and education.
Yeah.
And your mother and father hit both of them. We big on faith, big on education.
Yeah.
Why is that?
I think maybe there's an instinctive awareness, maybe there's just an innate awareness that there's truth in this whole philosophy of spirituality, that we are spiritual beings, and if we want to be what God called us to be, we need to fulfill our spirituality. And so the religion is the spiritual, and the spiritual is the real. And education seems to be the tool that God uses to prepare His people for productive, meaningful lives. That's why I always tell young people who I interact with that the call to the ministry is first a call to preparation. Study to show yourself approved unto God, a workman that need not be ashamed, who will rightly divide the word of truth. And there is this correlation between solid, sober spirituality and education. And tragically, many of our colleagues got it wrong and said that education was of the devil, but not so. God is wisdom, righteousness, power, and He desires that we would participate with Him in His righteousness and wisdom and power.
2 things about the environment, and then I'll start to ask you a few questions about college. But two questions I want to ask you about. Were you all acutely aware that blacks were suffering this way all over America, or did you feel real isolated?
We were not really totally isolated, because after the World War I and the years following, many of the blacks in the South, Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, Florida, migrated to the North and the East and the West. And they would come back home and tell us about